fire exit by proceeding left out of the room, down the main stairwell, and out of the main civic entrance, which is opposite. Everyone should assemble at the front of the town hall and must not re-enter the building until instructed to do so. If you have a disability which could affect your means of escape, could you please inform a member of staff so that arrangements can be made for your safe evacuation? And some broadcast information. Please be aware that this evening's meeting will be recorded for live and for subsequent broadcast on the council's YouTube channel. The whole of the meeting will be recorded except where there are confidential items or exempt items. This activity promotes democratic engagement in accordance with Section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972. The cameras will focus on the proceedings of the meeting and avoid areas specifically designated for members of the public. If you object to being filmed, please remain seated in the public seating area. All members and officers must use the microphones provided to enable the audio to be picked up by the system. Members are reminded to turn off their microphones when they are not formally addressing the committee. So agenda item number 1 is attendances, and we have apologies from Councillor Carey and Councillor Malik, and we have Councillor Sharp and Councillor Denise Weston substituting tonight. You're very welcome. Item number 2 is declarations of interest. A reminder to all members to declare any interest as the items appear on the agenda. And item 3 is the minutes of the previous meetings. And there's 2 sets of minutes for the 13th of December and the 10th of January. Would anybody like to move those as a true and correct record? Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Is that seconded? Councillor Stennett is seconding those minutes. Item 4 is questions from members of the public. A maximum of 15 minutes will be allocated to public questions submitted in writing to Democratic Services. No questions have been submitted this evening. Item number 5 is the additional information report. There are copies. I know members have got access to them. And for members of the public, there's some on the table in front of you. Item number 6 is applications to develop. And just before I do that, can I say a reminder to all members of the Planning Committee, myself included, that as well as our local knowledge, we look to our local development plan as a basis for decision making and other background papers listed at the beginning of agenda item 6 for guidance when making decisions this evening. So the first item on the agenda is we're going to go to page 47. That's South Bank and Delamere Lodge 1 to 2 Cavendish Road in Altrincham. Ms. Coley, the head of planning, is going to give us some information for this item. Thank you, Ms. Coley.
Thank you, Chairman. This application relates to a site located on the junction of Cavendish Road, Higher Downs and Delamere Road. This site is occupied by South Bank and the adjoining 16 Higher Downs, Delamere Lodge and the coach house attached to Delamere Lodge. The buildings were originally dwellings but latterly were in use as a nursing home. The site is located within the Downs Conservation Area, with its conservation area appraisal identifying these buildings as positive contributors. The site is also immediately adjacent to the Devisdale and Bowden conservation areas. Development at the site is currently ongoing, with much of the work approved under an earlier planning application. Some elements of the scheme have, however, been carried out which do not accord with the approved plans. Hence, the current application, which seeks approval for the scheme, largely is constructed. The amendments to the scheme are set out in full within the committee report. However, in summary, these relate to alterations to the roof, chimneys, elevations, windows, doors and balconies of the buildings and boundary treatments within the wider site. During the application process, the applicant has agreed to a number of further alterations to mitigate the harm to the conservation area arising from the amendments. Letters of objection have been received from 8 addresses, whilst letters of support have been received from 4 addresses. The overall level of harm is deemed to be less than substantial in heritage terms and in line with paragraph 196 of the MPPF, will need to be outweighed by the public benefits of the proposal if the application is to be approved. There are considered to be a number of public benefits associated with the development. Specifically, the scheme will deliver 15 new residential units on a brownfield site, and there are benefits associated with the redevelopment of a previously underused site and returning the buildings to their original residential use. Having considered the development as a whole, these public benefits are considered to be sufficient to clearly outweigh the less than substantial harm to the Downs Conservation Area, which has been identified in the report. In considering the impact of the proposed amendments to the approved scheme, the development is also not considered to have an unacceptable impact on the amenity of surrounding properties or in terms of highway safety. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms Coley. We've got 3 speakers to this item. I'm going to call Councillor Sean Anstey first. Councillor Anstey is speaking against the application. He has 5 minutes. If you'd like to take a seat, Councillor Anstey, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman, and I think I've been at Planning Committee more times in the last 6 months than I have in the last 10 years, but anyway, here we go. So, very pleased to be able to be here this evening. Thank you also for allowing this application to be heard first. It's really appreciated. Members will know that it's contained within the report that this site has a long history, a number of planning applications, both substantive planning applications originally in 2015, the follow-up in 2016, determined in 2017, with variations to that application being considered, and then this then being a further variation to those amendments. And the first point I think that we residents in particular, as neighbours of that development, would want to make is that the report starts from a premise that the amendments that are being considered this evening should be considered a variance to those previous amendments approved, and actually a view that if you took them from the originally consented application as opposed to the amendments that are being sought when assessed against the previously approved amendments, that there is more of a harm that is than the report alludes to based on the original design. I don't think there's any dispute from the neighbours that I've spoken to that development of this site can positively contribute to the conservation area if done sympathetically, but that the variance from the original consented scheme to that which is being requested tonight is significant, specifically in relation to the roof height, the windows and the privacy and the Juliet balconies. What the report then seeks to do is to say that this is a scheme which I know members of the committee cannot take into consideration in relation to construction, but that has, in the view of the neighbours of that development, caused considerable distress to them over a number of years. And what we want to try and do is to be able to say, well, if there's a recognition that development at this site can positively contribute to the conservation area, then the consented scheme as it stands is what they would wish to see. In the report, the Heritage Officer agrees that there is harm to the conservation area, and I know, bearing in mind what Mrs. Coley has just said, that the choice of members this evening is in relation to the extent of that harm, and it is the strong view of neighbours of that scheme that when you look at the significant variance to the originally consented scheme, that harm is greater than that which the report sets out itself. In terms of the objections that have been raised, there are a number of points that talk around residential amenity, size, scale and massing, the heritage and aesthetics of the building is now constructed and the way that it contributes to, or doesn't contribute even to, the ongoing support of the conservation area, height in particular, the pitch of the roof, and depending on which aspect and view you take of the pitch of the roof, the significance of it is greater than that which is set out in the report. So I think the view of residents for the committee this evening is twofold, really. One is that when planning permission is granted by this council, there should be an expectation, by and large, and I understand this is not always the case, but by and large, that the scheme that is consented is as it should be constructed. In this case, there's already been a variation to the amendments to the originally consented scheme that has been previously approved, and this is the second time now of asking for further amendments to the scheme that, like I said, when judged on the original scheme that is consented, are more significant than the report. And secondly, then, that as we see that the plans that are being submitted, that we want to make sure that all of the information that is included is as submitted. And I think there is a view that if you take, for example, the timber cladding on windows that you would rather see, that we think would contribute to the conservation area more positively, that that is consistently applied across a number of different planning applications that are seen across Bowdon. And so there is a strong view that in taking and determining the decision this evening, that trying to make sure that we have consistency in approaching our planning process, and then the construction process that follows it, is actually one of the things that we should be considering. And so the view of neighbours very strongly is that they if the committee is minded to grant the amendments this evening, that the ability to be able to ensure that some of the most significant concerns around roof height, around privacy, and around size and scale are considered. I think there are the following speaker to me now will go through in more detail a number of the different points that particularly concern neighbours, and that the planning committee should, in determining its deliberations this evening, make sure that it refers to the original consent as applied. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Anstey. Do we have Miss Sol Peters? Good evening, Miss Peters. If you'd like to take a seat, and you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Hello and thank you. I speak on behalf of the residents surrounding Cavendish Place. We'd like to say that we support the redevelopment of this brownfield site, and we support the development of 15 new dwellings. However, we do not support the complete deviation from the approved plans. In fact, 1.5 pages of changes, and a far cry from the original design. Firstly, and most prominently, there's been a long-standing debate about the overall height of Delamere Lodge. This is because the roof has been completely redesigned. And the pitch has changed. There's been a complete change to the pitch roof, and this is evident from the mismatching bricks at the gable end. It has been glossed over in the report, which is extremely relevant to the vastly increased mass and bulk of the building. And as a result, South Downs House, which is next door, no longer enjoys afternoon sunlight. Secondly, I'd like to refer to the design of the zinc seam, which is altered and increased in size, particularly on the balcony. I think you can actually see it now here. They've come it for further. We were sold this idea of a zinc seam. We didn't feel it sat well with the conservation area, but to make matters worse, it's now been split into 2 sections. So what was the first level, which is a low level, it then steps back to a higher level, and then retracts again to the balcony windows, effectively making the balcony twice the size, which obviously we're not happier with. And in an attempt to obscure the increased zinc seam, they've actually erected a very large box guttering, which we feel is out of character on this heritage asset. Furthermore, these increased elevations mean that the penthouse balconies totally impact the privacy of all the surrounding homes, offering a direct view of sitting rooms and bedrooms, which is wholly unacceptable. We also draw attention to the lack of screening on these balconies. In fact, it's clear glass, which we regard as a death trap to birds. This is a conservation area. There is a lot of wildlife. Again, we don't think this is acceptable. With regard to the roof tiles, we note the use of Spanish slate, which is machine cut. It's not a typical slate to use in a conservation area. We do not feel it's consistent with other properties. We question how Trinity Apartments and development literally 100 yards across the road and High Bank down the road at Green Walk can manage to source Welsh slate when De Trafford and Poachins cannot. We understand that Trinity Church reused 95% of their slate. We were told that the slate at this development was not good for use. I can't remember what I was saying. Anyway, we draw attention to the property owners, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Cross, who live at Curious, which is opposite this development, who replaced their roof last year. They chose a particular roof tile, but the planners insisted on another, more fitting and more expensive tile, and they duly obliged. We do not feel there can be one rule for developers and another for residents. We cannot accept this double standard.
If you'd like to sum up, Miss Williams.
Sorry?
We'd like to sum up.
Yes, yeah. I am. Of equal concern are the new aluminium window frames at development, when the planners have previously insisted that the neighbours replace frames with more expensive timber, and residents have accepted this directive. The residents therefore feel that the aluminium frames are a mockery to the planning process.
Miss Peters, apologies for calling you Miss Williams. Miss Peters, you really do need to finish now. You've had your 3 minutes.
This is my last sentence then. Okay. Ultimately, we do not feel this is a development we were promised. The developers have shown a total disregard for the planning procedure, the conservation area, and the residents.
Thank you, Miss Peters. Thank you. Do we have Mr. Grant? Would you like to take a seat? And you have 3 minutes, Mr. Grant. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to speak briefly about the application which is being considered tonight. A comprehensive report's been put together by officers which addresses all of the relevant matters in detail. The application is recommended for approval, and I therefore only want to make a few short points. The application has been submitted by Objections, who are appointed by the Trafford Estates as main contractor to undertake the construction works associated with the project, which obtained full planning permission in July 2017. The task of preserving and enhancing the retained buildings has proved very challenging. The buildings have been significantly adapted and extended over time and very poorly maintained. This led to several instances of collapse during the construction process. The original planning drawings contained a number of inaccuracies and inconsistencies, and in various parts of the development, it hasn't been possible to construct on site what was shown on the approved planning drawings. The purpose of this Section 73 application is therefore to regularise matters and seek approval for a revised set of planning drawings which reflect the scheme that's been developed. It also seeks to cover a number of design changes that have been needed since permission was granted. To try and bring matters to a satisfactory resolution, the project team have worked closely with the Council's planning and conservation officers, attending numerous meetings in the months leading up to the submission of the application in September last year, and also during the determination period. The scheme which is presented to you tonight represents the culmination of these discussions. As well as liaising with your officers, the project team has also kept in regular dialogue with local residents, and wherever possible, they have tried to address any concerns raised and accommodate suggestions made. We very much hope you can support the application tonight. Representatives from Objections and Ollie Smurthwaite Architects are also in attendance in case any technical or design queries arise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'd like to return to your seat. Okay, I'll leave it open to debate. Any members like to begin a discussion? Well, I'll do that then. I'll begin a discussion. I went to view this site on Sunday and was really impressed with what I saw. Such an improvement on what was there previously, as the residents will know more than I do. And there's a lot of amendments in this report, as Councillor Anstey alluded to. But for me, I read the report, and I think it sums up on page 52, where we have consultations, and it talks, the Heritage Development Officer gives his comments, and he talks about things that don't contribute to the conservation area, that don't enhance the heritage asset. These are the sash-style windows to Delamere Lodge, replacement slates. Ms. Peters talked about those. Alterations to fascia and eaves, detailing of Delamere Lodge, fencing to the boundary with 15 downs. Now, there have been some physical changes done since this report was done. It is actually in the additional information. Page 4 of the additional information, paragraph 3, low-level boundary fence, which was installed between 15 and 18, has been removed from the proposed plans on advice of the Council's Heritage Officer. Paragraph 4, the top course, top course of stone has been removed from the elevation, showing the vehicle access point from high downs to reflect the situation on site. I think the amendments, there are a few. It's not unusual for an applicant to make changes and to do those changes without permission if he sees that they're reasonable, and for him to come back to committee and talk to us about them. But On the whole, I don't see them as being so strongly to warrant refusal. And the heritage officer talks about the harm will require a clear and convincing justification in accordance with paragraph 196 of the MPPF. In other words, the harm has got to be so significant that it warrants refusal. And the heritage officer knows about these issues, and I suspect he knows all those issues that Miss Peters talked about, and a lot of the residents do, because that's his job. But he doesn't see them as being so significant to warrant refusal. He doesn't think they're perfect. He doesn't think the sash-style windows and Delamere Lodge replacement slates, alterations to fascia and eaves detailing is fine and dandy, and we would want the application to stay exactly as it was before. But in the round, in the bigger picture, is it so significant to refuse? I don't believe it is. And I'm going to propose, well, I'm the first person to speak, but I'm going to propose that we grant this application. But I look forward to hear what other members have got to say. Thank you. Ms. Cole is going to give us some clarification.
Yes, thank you. Whilst the speakers were speaking just then, we established that part of the additional information report is in front of members this evening is actually missing for this particular application. So if I could just raise a couple of points, just so members are absolutely clear about a couple of things, if that's okay. Thank you. I mentioned in my introduction that the application site is in the Downs Conservation Area, but also adjacent to the Bowden and the Deversdale conservation areas. So in the additional information report, we had carried out an assessment of the impact of the proposals on those two conservation areas as well, and assessed the significance of those and the proposals, and established that we didn't consider that there was any harm arising to either those two particular conservation areas. The other thing that the additional information report does do, this isn't missing, is roll the scheme back effectively to the baseline, i.e. before any development at this site took place at all. And that was a criticism made by the speaker, quite rightly, and it's in the additional information report. And our conclusion there is that when you measure it against a no development position, it remains, as far as we're concerned, less than substantial harm, and we still consider that those public benefits outweigh that less substantial harm. Although we do appreciate that that's it's a bigger drump. So just to make that clear, I mean, the other thing, just to clarify a point Councillor Walsh made about the Heritage Development Officer, she doesn't assess the public benefits. That's for us to do as planning officers. All she does is consider the level of harm, and she's identified that as less than substantial, but she's not raising a specific objection to these proposals, and has left it to officers and to members in making their decision to determine whether those public benefits outweigh that harm or otherwise. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Bunting.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm going to reluctantly agree with the position that you're taking, and I can tell obviously from the way you put it that you're not thrilled about it either, but it is, I do share the annoyance of Councillor Anstey and Ms Peters that, how difficult is it to decide what you want to do before you're going to do it? And I accept that the developer has come back and said that, look, it's an old building, it was in poor state of repair, we didn't quite assess it correctly, and therefore we're having to come back and keep changing what we're doing because we keep discovering things that are not how we thought they were. Well, yeah, you could maybe accept that as the once if it was but to have come back twice starts to look something like carelessness, really. It would be nice if in future they actually assessed the work they needed to do before they started to do it. It's not unusual, and I've dealt with old properties before. I grew up in one that was substantially rebuilt, and yes, you can get we got a very substantial report done by a surveyor, so we knew exactly what was wrong with it before we started to do it. It's not that difficult. So whilst I share the annoyance of the objectors and the fact that this should have been done properly in the first place, I do agree with you, Chairman, that the changes, although I must admit they're not to my taste, many of them, I agree with you there, absolutely. I would much rather it had been done the way it was supposed to be done. These aren't quite, they're not severe enough to cause us to refuse the application. and insist that everything be undone that has already been done. Yes, I accept that it is better than that which was there before, although let's face it, that's not that difficult considering it was a sort of fairly dilapidated mess before. Yes, it's better than we had on that site previously, but it could have been so much better if things had been done correctly. And so it is perhaps a missed opportunity to make the building look absolutely as it should be, and there wouldn't be any complaints at all. So with very little enthusiasm, Chairman, I am seconding your proposal. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Williams, please.
Thank you, Chair. I will admit that when I first read the report, I found it somewhat difficult to try and understand the specificities of the objections that have been raised by local residents. So I'm grateful for Councillor Anstey and also Ms Peters' efforts this evening to provide a bit of clarification. I do have a bit of familiarity with the site as I grew up just around the corner from this area, and I've still got family living in the area. And as such, I have myself over the past few months seen what was previously something of an eyesore being developed into an attractive residential development. I have read through the range of objections that have been raised and also listened to the representations made by Councillor Anstey and Ms Peters. But it seems to me, I think, and I'm in agreement with yourself, Chair, here, that this is a matter of judgment as to the extent to which the variations proposed will cause harm to the heritage and aesthetics of the buildings and the surrounding area. Having a bit of a familiarity with the site and seeing the enhancements that the current developments brought, I personally feel on balance quite confident in agreeing with the officer recommendation. I find the assessment that's been provided to us in paragraphs 23 to 56 of the report to be comprehensive and quite convincing. And as such, I'd also be minded to vote in favour of the officer recommendation this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Dr Barclay.
Thank you, Chairman. I definitely agree with Councillor Anstey. There have been a number of developments in Bowden over the last few months where we've had very large developments take place, and they've actually not followed the original approved plans, and it is incredibly frustrating and disappointing for residents who look at plans, see what's been approved, and then only to find, as they see the things going up, that they're quite different to how they appeared when they were originally approved. So I'm really sympathetic to residents from that point of view. However, as Councillor Walsh has said, it's not unusual, particularly when there's very large builds, and particularly when buildings are in a poor state, because after all, until you actually start to work on a building, we've all experienced that ourselves in our own homes, you don't really know exactly what you're going to expect. So there is that kind of mitigates for the changes. I am really sympathetic to residents because, as I've said, it's nice to know what you're going to get, and when you don't see the same thing, it is really disappointing. But even if we rejected and refused this application tonight, given that there is less than substantial harm or reasonable harm to the conservation area, should it go to appeal, which I'm sure it would be taken to appeal, given that our officers are satisfied, there's no breaches of any planning policy, it would be very unlikely that that refusal would be maintained, it would be overturned. So I think we have to be really realistic. We have to live in the real world. It is hard to accept that things are not how we want them to be. We keep trying to put out messages to developers that it's really important you communicate all the changes that you're making with residents. Certainly would help the process, and it's very inflammatory when developers don't. But on this occasion, there is really nothing I think that we can really refuse the application on that would be upheld at appeal. So therefore, I am going to have to support the application, but I recognise the concerns of the residents. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for your conciliatory tone, Dr Barclay. Councillor Patel.
Thank you. My fellow committee members have echoed really my thoughts on it. It's a unique location in Trafford. It's a sensitive site. And I'd like to acknowledge the disappointment of residents that feel that they thought they knew what was happening on the site. This approach taken by some developers, a minority of developers, does in some way undermine the public confidence in the planning system. But I accept the explanation that about the state of the building and the collapse of some of the property. Just a couple of questions. The The balconies that was mentioned, the distance, the loss of privacy caused by balconies, is that something that's acceptable? And the question about the roof tiles, where standards have been applied to nearby properties, but not in this case?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The balconies have been assessed and are considered to be acceptable in terms of the separation distance, and we don't consider they would lead to a loss of privacy. The issue with the slates is noted. We have carefully considered that, as has our heritage development officer, as to whether that is appropriate. And on balance, we think in this particular case that the slates, that the Spanish slate that they have used is appropriate. And again, the harm is the public benefits continue to outweigh that harm. It is acknowledged harm. It's acknowledged in the committee report, but we don't think it's so substantial that the benefits of the scheme don't outweigh that.
You happy with that answer, Councillor Patel? Yeah. Any more speakers? It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against? We're going to go to page 1 now. That's Trafford Plaza, 73 Seymour Grove, Old Trafford. And we have 2 speakers against this application, Councillor Jarman and Dr. Mills. Does anybody want to go first? Councillor Jarman or Dr. Mills? Just take your seat, Dr. Mills. Just bear with me. Ms. Cole is going to give us some information.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a brief introduction. This application proposes the erection of a 17-storey building accommodating 174 apartments at land to the rear of the former Trafford Plaza building on Seymour Grove in Old Trafford. There was a previous Planning Committee resolution from June 2017 to grant this application subject to the completion of a Section 106 agreement. The application is now returning to committee as part of the site has changed ownership. The applicant wishes to replace the Section 106 requirement relating to the parking spaces with a planning condition, as the new landowner is not willing to be a party to the 106. The new parking condition would require each parking space within the site to be allocated to either the existing or proposed Trafford Plaza building. This is considered to provide a greater degree of certainty as to the allocation of spaces within the site. No other amendments to the Section 106 requirements are proposed. The proposed development is considered to remain acceptable in all other respects, being otherwise identical to the scheme approved at the June 2017 committee meeting. There have been no material changes in planning circumstances which would warrant a different view being taken. It is acknowledged that a recent petition has been submitted opposing the development, and all the issues raised by that petition are addressed in the officer report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Dr. Mills, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
On behalf of the residents of Madison Apartments, Park Rise, formerly known as Trafford Plaza, Friends of Seymour Park and other local groups, we contest the application for development on the following planning grounds. The daylight, sunlight and overshadowing report is flawed. Its calculations are contestable and completely ignore the ground floor residences as Madison Apartments, where the daylight calculations are extremely unlikely to meet the BRE recommended value of 0.8. It also completely ignores the major impact on the new residents of Park Rise and the impact on Park Rise on Seymour Park and its many users. The popular children's play area directly adjacent to the proposed development will be shrouded in darkness for much longer periods, making it less attractive to children from the local community, forcing activities further into the park. The ecology report takes no note of the potential environmental damage to Seymour Park, not only from the effect to daylight from such a tall building, but also potentially fatal damage to the roots of surrounding trees from digging foundations. The development already carried out on Park Rise has destroyed 5 aspen and cherry trees, not replaced. Habitats and biodiversity for much of the west side of the park will also be affected. There is still no affordable housing component to this development. Variability assessment should now be done on an open book basis, but there is no viability assessment available to view. According to the Northern Powerhouse Livability Index 2018, Trafford is the 7th worst local authority in the north for affordability. The proposed 16-storey high-rise development does not respect and enhance the quality and character of the local built environment as outlined in the townscape and visual impact assessment, as it adversely affects the street scene by reason of scale and height. The development is surrounded by a well-used and popular park on two sides and two mid-rise developments, Madison Apartments and Park Rise. Beyond the immediate surroundings, most buildings are low-rise shops and terraced housing. The developers have circulated a deliberately deceptive mock-up picture published in the Manchester Evening News, implying that the new development would be of a similar height to Park Rise and Madison Apartments. The transport statement fails to take note of the increased traffic. 91 spaces for the proposed development on top of the 70 from the Park Rise Apartments and 70 spaces used by Paragon House, 231 in total. According to the council's own guidelines, SPD3 parking standards and design, there will be a possible shortfall of 193 parking spaces for the new development, which will have a huge effect on the on-street parking in the area. The New World supermarket, due to open opposite, will also increase traffic, meaning that at peak times, Seymour Grove will become severely gridlocked, unable to allow access to emergency vehicles who already cannot enter Humphrey Road because of unenforced parking restrictions.
Would you like to sum up, Dr. Mills? Thank you.
Traffic. Okay, we believe that additional developments across Trafford since the date of the original application for development since the date of the original development that are not part of the Trafford core strategy surely allow the Trafford Council to pass the housing delivery test for the last 3 years without continuing with this controversial development.
Thank you, Dr. Mills. If you'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Jarman is a local ward councillor, and he has 5 minutes. Thank you, Councillor Jarman.
Thank you, Chair. I originally spoke against the original application in June 2017, just a couple of days after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, when I outlined my concerns about it. I was quite surprised to see it back before the committee again, 18 months later, and to see that all the issues had not been finalised satisfactorily. You may see you may see it as just a minor variation, but it gives us an opportunity to revisit this with fresh eyes. And for some members of the committee, it will be for the first time. I'm certainly very supportive of the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework and development of brownfield sites, but I believe this scheme could be improved in terms of reducing the height of the buildings and increasing Section 106 green space and affordable housing benefits. Specifically, in its current form, is that it is excessively large and too imposing compared to the surrounding buildings. Most of the other buildings around are no more than 9 stories high, such as the former office block, which it now dwarfs, which it will dwarf. There has been a weight of objections. The petition the planning officer mentioned of 232 people, and an objection letter from the Humphrey Road Mosque, and also an email from Seymour Park School. The main concern amongst the residents is the lack of parking, the blocking out of natural light, loss of sunlight and amenity. It will cast a large shadow over Madison Apartments next door and also Park Rise on the existing site. Apparently, the head teacher of Seymour Park School had not been consulted despite being a significant amenity benefit to the school, as this will have a detrimental effect on Seymour Park. We all need the health benefits that sunlight gives us, and we see precious little of it in this country as it is. It will also generate a large increase in traffic, adding pressure to the surrounding roads at peak times, adding to noise and air pollution. In addition to less than one parking space allocated for two dwellings is totally inadequate, no matter how the planners try and dress it up. So The proposition of using public transport, walking and cycling may be the ideal goal, but I believe that it is currently unrealistic. Services are already stretched as far as I can see, with no proper survey has been done of the local infrastructure and what effect a large and sudden increase in the population will have on schools, medical facilities, as well as security and emergency services, etc., which are already stretched. In the report, the planning officers have gone through each strand of objection and given their reason why it's not grounds for refusal, so therefore rejecting each one. The developers obviously believe that the sheer weight of their evidence, some very scientific and some not so much, will tip the balance in favour of approval. They obviously have the means and wherewithal to prepare all this, as it seems to be the standard format adapted for this particular application. Most of this is quite baffling to the layperson and difficult to challenge, as there is over 160 documents, a lot of which are quite lengthy, and it is impossible to read every word of every page. All you need to know that it is too large and should be refused in its current form, and encourage the applicant to come back with a scaled down proposal with increased community benefits. This is a mammoth multi-million-pound development. Somehow the developers have managed to avoid paying any community surcharge. The only environmental offset is £2,000 to plant 15 saplings in Seymour Park. In addition, the affordable housing contribution should be more in line with the development value. So all I'm asking you to do is to revisit this application, take a step back and review as to whether the scale and community benefits are proportional, when only 50% of the profit margin above 20% will apply, but only when a substantial quantity of the units are sold. On a multi-million-pound development of this magnitude, I don't believe that we've got the balance quite right. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Councillor Jam. I'd like to return to your seat. Do we have Mr. Baker? Mr. Baker, if you'd like to take a seat. And you have 3 minutes. Thank you. You switch your microphone on, Mr. Baker.
Did not. Is that? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Apologies. Hello. Some members will recall that this committee had previously minded to grant this application subject to the completion of a Section 106 agreement. The proposal is part of a wider master plan for the site, which includes the residential conversion of the existing building and related car parking. The new build proposal particularly considered the impact of the development on the amenity of neighbouring residents and complies with the guideline 30-metre separation distances. The residential conversion of the existing building has now been completed and provides 96 apartments with related parking. What we are proposing is to replace the previous Section 106 requirement relating to the car parking spaces for both buildings. A planning condition would require each parking space within the site to be allocated to either the existing or the proposed building. This is a more appropriate mechanism to address the parking requirement. Parking allocation will provide a greater degree of certainty as to the allocation of spaces within the site. The previous committee resolution simply required the spaces within the site to be made available to residents of both buildings. There was no certainty as to exactly how the spaces would be allocated. New residents will be aware when they purchase or move into a unit whether they will have an on-site parking space or not, and it will naturally limit the number of occupiers of the building with a car who do not have use of an on-site parking space. In conclusion, the scheme complies with the development plan and provides a number of public benefits. The scheme will deliver a sustainable development, including 174 new residential units on a brownfield site. It will make a significant contribution to the council's housing land supply figures and targets for delivering residential development. The scheme will also boost the local economy, both through the provision of construction jobs and new residents contributing towards local shops and services. A Section 106 has been discussed with officers and is in final draft and can be completed quickly. For these reasons, we request that this application and proposed parking condition be approved. Thank you.
Any members like to begin the debate? Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. As we've already said, this is essentially just a change in terms of conditions. Previously, we've passed an application for the exact same thing. So obviously, if we try to refuse this now, then enter an appeal, then obviously they say, well, you passed it last time. What's changed? And the answer is, well, nothing much apart from this 106. So all this does is just redesignate who parks where within the site, and also means that people have got a clarification as to whether they have a space on site or not. So if a person, for example, doesn't, desperately needs a car and they think, well, I can't get a space, well, then they might choose to look elsewhere. Or if they don't use a car, well, then they'd be happy. So it would naturally allow people to assess whether they'd be able to park there in advance. So that means that you won't get a whole lot of people who all need to have a car urgently moving into a place where they know they're not going to get any parking spaces. So that's going to a fair degree mitigate. Okay, there will always be some who will say, well, I'll move in and worry about where to park later, but most people wouldn't do that. So that's all we're talking about. So I accept that many people are unhappy about many other aspects of it, but we've already agreed in principle the actual build itself. So the various arguments are, well, I don't like this and that about the building. All we're really focusing on is this change in this condition from a 106 to a condition. So there's nothing really much more to discuss this evening other than that, and I can't see anything in that change itself that would cause me to have a problem with the application. If anything, it seems like a positive move that will assist the application rather than a negative to detract away from it. So on those grounds, Chairman, I can see no real option, given the fact that we've already agreed the building in principle, to accept the officer's recommendation, and I propose that we grant the application on that basis, i.e. with the condition instead of the 106. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Anybody else? Councillor Patel.
Thank you. 2017 was before my time on this committee, and had I been at that 2017 committee, I think I would have shared some of my colleague Councillor Jarman's concerns about this. It's not the impact on the surrounding accommodation. I accept the officer's report in those areas. But I find a 16-storey building adjacent to a public park overlooking an area where young people are on skateboards and a youth centre to be a bit concerning. There's a part of the report that asks for further clarification about noise nuisance and how windows facing the park will be placed to avoid nuisance. And I'm concerned that young people in the park will become a nuisance, although they were there first. I take Councillor Jarman's point about the documentation being quite difficult, the technical stuff quite difficult for the public to understand. And 193 car parking spaces short, is that an accuracy? No, because if it is, I'd find that, schemes have come to this committee where are much, have caused alarm if that's the case. Could I ask, have we revisited the affordable housing allocation with this new application, or is that something that we're just carrying over from, we haven't revisited it from 2017? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Yes, we've been working on the Section 106 agreement since the June 2017 resolution by the committee. And part of that 106 agreement is a viability review at 95% occupation, which effectively means that if the development is able to provide an affordable housing contribution, then it will do so at that point. So there is no need to revisit it because it will be already. Thank you. Would you like me to clarify the point on the parking numbers as well? Yes, certainly. So in paragraph 58 of the officer report, we assess the parking requirement at the site, and our assessment is that the proposals equate to a shortfall of 43 spaces, not 193 spaces. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Councillor Patel, are you happy with those answers?
The answer on both those answers are reassuring. Thank you.
Councillor Patel. Anybody else? Councillor Coggins, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to, I suppose, echo a lot of what Councillor Patel has said, and I also wasn't on the committee at the time this was previously discussed, and you know, I share a lot of the concerns that we've heard mentioned. I see it's in an air quality management area, and we're getting 3 electric vehicle parking spaces, and there's a number of other concerns, not least the overshadowing, especially in lower floor in the lower floors of nearby park. Buildings and park. But as Councillor Bunting has said, given the extant permission that has been granted, I can't see how any of these can be used now in a way that would be immune to appeal. So I think I'll reluctantly be voting in support of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coggins. Yep, Ms. Cole is going to give us some information.
Thank you. Can I just clarify, there's not an extant permission, there's just a resolution to grant. So members are considering the proposals as a whole, but given the previous resolution of the committee, it's considered that it would be unreasonable to really come back from that. Thank you.
Any other members want to contribute? No? Councillor Patel.
Just going back to the point of the height of the building next to the public park, the report mentioned that this is there are buildings of height around Seymour Park. That's not my understanding of the park. This is a substantial, uniquely substantial development abutting the park. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, there are mid-rise buildings. There's Madison Apartments. There are other taller buildings. I completely accept there's nothing of this scale around the park.
And Madison and Trafford Plaza that's there now are obviously close to the park as well, Councillor Patel. I don't think any other members want to contribute. I think we're going to go to a vote. It's been moved and seconded. And seconded by Councillor Coggins, seconding it. Apology accepted, Councillor Bunting. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against? Councillor Patel. That application has been granted. Thank you, everybody. The next item on the agenda is page 79. That's the former Itron site, Talbot Road, Stretford. And with 2 speakers speaking in favour of this application, Councillor Duffield and Mr. Smith. Does anybody want to go first? Councillor Bunting.
Introduction, Chairman.
There's some information from Ms. Coley to come, Councillor Bunting. Just hold your fire. Do we have Councillor Duffield and Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, you'd like to take a seat? And before you begin, Ms. Coley is going to give us some. Mr. Pearson, rather, is going to give us some information. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just the introduction to the application. So this application relates to the site of the vacant former Itron premises in Stretford. Full planning permission is sought for the demolition of all existing structures and the erection of 10 apartment blocks containing a total of 191 residential units, as well as 91 houses. The houses are 2 to 3 stories in height, whilst the apartment buildings range from 3 to 6 stories. Letters of objection have been received from 8 addresses, whilst letters of support have been received from 4 addresses. The concerns raised largely relate to the number of units proposed and potential highway impacts of the development. Officers are satisfied that the principle of residential development of this site is appropriate, and that the proposal would make best use of a brownfield site by delivering 282 new homes in a sustainable location that is well served by public transport. The scheme was developed through pre-application discussions with the local planning authority and an independent design review by Places Matter. Through this process, the applicant has made significant changes to the scheme. It is considered that their approach in not using standard house types represents a refreshing and welcome departure from the approach generally adopted by volume house builders, and that should be applauded. The proposed development is considered to demonstrate an excellent standard of design and would have a clear positive impact on the character of its surroundings. Officers consider that access to the developments is appropriate, as is the level of parking and cycle parking, whilst the development would not generate a level of additional vehicle movements that would unacceptably impact on the surrounding highway network. Officers are also satisfied that the proposal is acceptable in terms of housing mix, residential amenity, noise, air quality, heritage impacts, contamination, and matters of flooding and biodiversity, subject to appropriate conditions. The applicant has offered a policy-compliant level of on-site affordable housing, equating to 1 affordable house and 12 affordable apartments. Half of these would be shared ownership units and half affordable rents. These figures have been calculated following the application of vacant building credit, which officers are satisfied is applicable in this instance. The applicant has also agreed to provide a financial contribution of £559,708 towards off-site open space improvements. The application is recommended for approval, subject to a Section 106 obligation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Mr. Smith, you have 3 minutes. Councillor Bunting.
As I said before, I've heard the information from Mr. Pearson, and sure the information coming from the two speakers would be most interesting, but given the fact that they're both speaking in favour of the application, your officer recommendations in favour of the application, and I would regard this as a fairly clear-cut case, I would again test the water. Chairman has moved straight to the vote if that's happy with you.
It was just to say that I know that this application has generated quite a lot of public interest, and I know that we're being broadcast, and I wonder if people who are watching and who are here would like to hear the debate.
I think we'll continue, Councillor Bunting. We'll let Mr. Smith speak. Thank you for your interjection. Mr. Smith, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, councillors. My name is Ian Smith. I'm the Managing Director of Miller Homes Northwest, and I'm here to personally support the application to transform the former Itron industrial site into 282 new homes, together with communal space and car and cycle parking. The redevelopment of the Itron facility is the #1 priority project in our business, and we're keen to start the remediation strategy as soon as possible to deliver the new homes at the earliest opportunity. We've worked closely with your officers and with Places Matter on the design since May 2017 to reach this stage and to ensure that the scheme in front of you does justice to its gateway location. It has evolved and improved over time, and we hope that the proposals will set a high benchmark for future residential sites in the borough. It has a bespoke, high-quality design, which we are extremely proud of and which our officers agree will have a clear, positive impact on the character of its surroundings. By creating this development, we will be embarking on a major programme of decontamination. We have arranged for our specialist contractors to be ready to commence work immediately following planning approval, subject to tonight's decision, and our forthcoming purchase of the site, our legal completion of the purchase, so that the substantial demolition and remediation programme can commence and regenerate what is perceived to be a notable local eyesore. As Itron, the business has vacated the site, the buildings are clearly very difficult to keep secure, and trespassers regularly gain entry to the site, hence our keenness to get started. On the basis that planning permission is granted, we would look to hoard off the site immediately following site purchase while the demolition and remediation strategy is implemented, and we are aiming to see the first occupation of new homes on the development in April and May of 2020. We're pleased to present an application that delivers a fully policy compliant level of affordable housing on the site, which includes 13 affordable homes, and we expect those to be managed by the Trafford Housing Trust. We have explored all options to maximise the number of affordable homes delivered on the site and have demonstrated openly to your officers why it would be unviable for any additional properties to be delivered as affordable homes. And I think it's fair to say that there has been a robust debate around this matter and that it's been thoroughly tested through the planning process. I very much hope that you can see the level of ambition that we have for this development and our commitment to quality as presented through the application. From our community communication and few objections, we believe that local residents want to see the site developed. And I finally would respectfully ask you please to support your officer's recommendation to approve our application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. You'd like to return to your seat. Councillor Duffield. Local ward councillor, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to speak in support of the development of this site. It's a site that most of us will drive past most times that we come to the town hall here, and has been lying empty for some time. It's a strategic site close to good transport links to the Stretford town centre and deserves a high quality development, and I feel that that's what Miller Homes will develop here. As ward councillors, we've met with Miller Homes on 3 occasions since last September and are pleased to see that the design process they've gone through, as our officer has indicated, has been a developed scheme that's not just a dull volume house building, but has brought a standard to Stretford that we expect. From the feedback that we've had, people are very welcoming of the scheme, and we know that Miller Homes have worked closely with Places Matter through that design review that's brought an added value to the process. Just in terms of the affordable housing, this scheme delivers just 13 units or 4.5%, and while being policy compliant due to the application of the vacant building credit, I think the question of whether or not more could have been delivered does remain open. However, we understand that this is policy compliant and therefore have to accept that this is the level that this scheme will deliver. We have in very robust terms made our views very clear to Miller Homes, not to return to this committee in the future to try to reduce the amount of affordable housing, the very small amount of affordable housing that is available here in this policy compliant position. Just on behalf of the residents, I'd just like to raise the issue of the traffic on Christie Road. And while we appreciate that it's not a matter for this planning committee, we would like to bear in mind that those of you that live locally will know that this junction can be extremely difficult to navigate, and we would appreciate some extra thought being given to the challenges that already exist, even if that's not directly through this planning application. We welcome the 577,000 of the open spaces money. And I'd just like to finish with highlighting paragraph 139 in the report of the number of public benefits that arise from this proposed scheme, which are considered to demonstrably outweigh any residual harm. The scheme will deliver 282 new residential units on a brownfield site, a significant contribution to the council's housing land supply figures and targets. It will deliver some, if not a small amount, of affordable housing under shared ownership and affordable rent, and will bring about the redevelopment of a underused site. We also hope that Miller Homes sign up to the Trafford Pledge, where job seekers are matched with local businesses, and see no reason why this wouldn't be the case. So, Chairman and committee, thank you for your time, and I look forward to your deliberations in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duffield. I'd like to return to your seat. Who would like to open the debate? Councillor Wetton.
Thank you, Chairman. It's good to see an application of this size come before us, and I think everybody involved in this would see this as good use of this site. It's moving more of the land of Stretford into residential use, which can only be a good thing. I like the designs. I know the work of this architect quite well, and I like the contemporary designs that they create. And I think what they've produced here will sit very well in the within the wider area that we're looking at. Clearly, there'll be some issues around traffic, and I think that is going to need some greater thought. And I can see that there will be some redesigning of the road layout. Will evolve as part of this as this scheme comes to fruition. But it's not insurmountable. It's something that can and I'm sure will be sorted out. So I'm very supportive of this application. In fact, as I'm first to speak, I would move the recommendation that we're minded to grant subject to the legal agreement. Just one final comment, really, and that is to the developer. all too often we see applications come to this committee, but we never see the properties built. I'm hearing very positive messages from the gentleman who spoke to us. So I don't think I need to say this, but I'm going to build these homes as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wetton. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. I don't intend to speak at length to this application, as it strikes me as being something of a no-brainer, really. I welcome that the application proposes to bring much-needed residential units to a disused industrial site at the heart of Stratford. I do recognise that there have been some letters of objection received, but I would say that I took some time last night to look over the M33 Stratford Facebook page, and it's really clear that there's quite considerable support for this development amongst the community. Like Councillor Duffy, I have to say I feel a sense of disappointment that a bit more could not have been achieved in respect of affordable housing. I don't think a dozen units is anything to get particularly excited about, but I will welcome the contributions that are being offered toward open space improvements in the area. And with that, I second the application, the proposed approval of the application.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor Coggins.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, largely welcome. It seems a bit more creative in its use of space than a lot of the applications that we see, and it is at least compliant with the affordable housing, which is welcome. My two concerns were that this is, as we're told in paragraph 66, part of it is in the air quality management area, but we haven't managed to put in any electric vehicle charging spaces, which, given that we're asking people, and these are family homes, a lot of them, to live in or on the edge of an air quality management area, to not be giving them the option of reducing the pollution there. It's not a terribly expensive thing to do. And my other concern was just on paragraph 95 on page 106, the cycle storage provision I see is to be sort of confirmed later. It's been delegated, I think. I see there's just a concern about the size of the area laid out for cycle parking relative to the amount of bikes that are meant to get in there, and I'm sure the delegated planning offices will ensure that it meets the minimum standards, but even those minimum are quite difficult to use. So yes, thank you.
Councillor Patel.
Just quickly, really to echo the thoughts, it's a really positive scheme that I wanted to hear at the committee, because it would be nice to see more of this in terms of design, in terms of involving ward councillors in discussions along the way. It'll improve the frontage in Stratford. It's a good mix of properties, and the off-site provision for sporting facilities is really welcomed. I hope some of that funding will be dedicated to community-led initiatives. Be nice to see. Yes, well done.
Thank you, Councillor Patel. Anybody else? Councillor Bunting.
Yes, just briefly, Chairman. Thank you. Just as I said before, just I don't want to go on too long because we're all sitting here violently agreeing with each other. It is a very positive move. It's a site that's long overdue in terms of its redevelopment. I understand the reasons why it hasn't been redeveloped more speedily, but it is at least now here. I'm often not the greatest fan of modern design, as is well known around this room, but this is considerably better than most that we get, and I look forward to seeing it built. The only thing I would say is a plea to the developers has already been stated by one of my colleagues. Please just get on with it as quickly as possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Councillor Evans.
Last contribution, and not a positive one, really. I'm going to echo Councillor Coggins's. Not a single electric charging point in 282 properties, including houses, does seem particularly odd. If I proposed a number, would I literally have to pick one out of the air, Mrs. Coley? Or would there be a number that you might like to suggest? I think we should perhaps ask, given they are so cheap to fit in at this stage, whereas retrofitting to these houses will be particularly difficult.
Had we? Right. Okay. There's no policy that we have adopted development plan policy which requires electric charging points, so we can't insist on them in planning applications at the moment. That position will change, but isn't the position at the moment. We did ask for some, and the answer was no. I don't know what number that was. I wouldn't want to pluck a number out of the air. That's not what you do in planning. What I might suggest could work is if you want, as it's being deferred and delegated for 106, we can have a discussion with them, and if they're willing to accept an additional planning condition for some electric vehicle charging points, then we will add that. But I don't think you can insist on it.
Mr. Smith, you want to speak? Are you happy with that, Councillor Evans?
I'm happy with that, and I'll add the comments. That's great, and I think that's reasonable to be delegated. As I have the floor, and we have a house builder here, fibre to the premise is an issue across the whole of GM, and I'm sure there won't be any provision here. But as you move forward, fibre to the premise as opposed to fibre to the cabinet, I'd like that to be considered in future developments. That's all.
I think that's been noted, Councillor Evans. One or two members talked about highways issue. Mr. Everton, do you want to talk about highways issues? I think Councillor Wetton had a concern that Christie Road's going to be a bit busy. Certainly, the junction going out onto Chester Road is going to change slightly with the development. Would you like to take that away, or would you like to comment now?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, in terms of any improvements, there's some amendments to some of the local roads in terms of the traffic calming, but in terms of any junction improvements, there isn't any. And the reason for that, as much as anything, is we have to balance it up on what is already there. So whilst the site has been closed for many years, it's still got effectively a planning purpose. It's still got a use. So effectively, there is still an extant use, which somebody could eventually come along and open it back up. Highly unlikely, yes, but from what we actually judge the planning application, we put an estimate on what the likely traffic generation could be for the site. So when you balance that up with what is being proposed, it isn't significant enough to actually justify or warrant any improvements of that nature of what you refer to. However, there is some improvements, or there is a bid going in for some improvements at the junction of what you're referring to, particularly for improvements to cycle provisions. And if that's successful, then there will be some improvements, but not on the back of this particular development.
Are you happy with that answer, Councillor Wetton? Yeah. Councillor Coggin talked about cycling stands. I don't know whether Mr. Smith might talk about cycling with our officers later.
The provision meets our standards, Chairman.
Okay. Okay, we're happy with that. Nobody else wants to speak. Can I just mention about the cherry trees? Looked at the plans today and saw the cherry trees that are on Renton Road. But when I read the report, of course, all the trees are going, including the cherry trees that are on Renton Road, aren't they? So I asked to declare an interest. I used to actually work at the Itron site, and we did actually employ 1,000 people at one time. So Christie Road was very busy. But I think, as Mr. Evanson was alluding to, it's taken a lot of traffic in the past, and if you like, that's an extant permission for that site. So a lot of vehicles have used that site previously. Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. Less sentimentality from myself. With the amendments so described by Councillor Evans. Moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour of granting, please show. And those against, that application is granted. Thank you very much. The next application we're going to is page 38. That's 56 Adele Drive in Sale. There are no speakers to this application. I think I've jumped the gun here, but we'll run with it anyway. Okay, scratch that, everybody. We'll go back to where the speaker is. We've got Mr. Bennett with us for 5 Groby Court. That's page 124. Mr. Bennett is speaking in favour of the application.
The application proposes the erection of a single-storey extension on the eastern side elevation of the apartment block to accommodate a new ensuite bathroom and study. A new patio area is proposed, which would extend across the width of the northern elevation and wrap around to the eastern elevation. Letters of objection have been received from the occupiers of 7 properties. The key considerations in this case are the impact of the proposed development on the Devisdale Conservation Area and on the residential amenity of the occupiers of neighbouring apartments. Officers consider that the scheme would not cause any harm to these interests, and the application is therefore recommended for approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Coley. Mr. Bennett, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish everybody a wonderful Valentine's evening. I'm sure we're enjoying each other's company this evening and would rather be nowhere else. But thank you, Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen of the committee for hearing me this evening. It seems somewhat out of line given the multi-million-pound development opportunities, but yeah, it's obviously for the real person, which is me, a disabled gentleman, quite an important development. I would like to kind of address some of the non-planning issues in the first instance. Maybe guidance would be given or not, but before acquiring the leasehold to number 5 Groby Court, through the estate agent, we did actually contact the freeholder to seek provisional permission to make extension. And fortunately, despite the contradictory note in the report, I have an email from the freeholder to the estate agent saying that in principle, no objection would be levelled. So obviously, I'm going through the process to seek approval, and then retrospectively, or then in respect of the freeholder, we would hope to gain such permission. The number of objections that have been levelled, I guess I'll just try to address as many as I can in the time allocated. But in effect, I am trying to improve the property, and I believe, as Mr. Chairman, hopefully you saw on Sunday, precedent is already in place with double patio doors from flat 1, which is in the adjacent block, giving access to a flat area of communal area to enable access to the communal grounds. I'm seeking exactly the same in a mirror image of my flat, so that the patio doors would enable me to enter the communal grounds on a flat surface, as opposed to what currently I have quite dangerous steps from the kitchen. I believe, again, that will add not only value to myself, but also for any future occupant of the property, that they're able then to access those communal grounds. I'd also note that nothing is overlooked from a flat, despite so I think that that's again a falsehood. As it relates to kind of any patioed area, of course it is communal, but again I was seeking to improve the grounds for all residents, because again I think it's quite treacherous, the slope that's down there, and actually the other young lady on the ground floor wouldn't even be able to walk around like myself without an improved kind of service to walk on. Again, I'd have to achieve the freeholder's support. So without wanting to take everybody's time this evening, I think that in relation to the objections raised, yes, of course there is some communal ground that needs to be respected, but I don't believe that I impact on anybody's property other than my own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I'd like to return to your seat. Any members wish to comment? Councillor Coggins.
Thank you, Chair. I know this spot well, and it is a lovely, peaceful spot in the conservation area, and I can see it's caused a lot of concern among residents, and I can see why they're worried about changing that lovely spot. It does seem that most of the issues that have been raised are not relevant planning issues, and there seems to be a lot of legal issues, which I understand people think will have to be considered by the planning committee, but aren't really our department. So although I acknowledge the concerns of the neighbours, we've got to act within the confines of planning law and just consider the relevant material considerations. So I think on balance, we'll be voting in favour of this. Thank you. So we can consider that.
Are you proposing
proposed?
granting,
Yes.
Councillor Collins? Thank you for that. Anybody like to second that proposal? Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chair. And like Councillor Coggins, I'm happy to second this proposal. I'd like to thank Mr. Bennett for attending this evening to represent himself. And I suppose it's a bit of a shame, really, that none of the objectors were prepared to attend this evening and put their case to the committee. It's hard to agree with them if they're not prepared to actually represent themselves. So I'm happy to second voting in favour of the application this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Anybody else? Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against, that application has been granted. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Okay, we're going to go to page 136. That's 44 Dartford Road in Urmston. And we've actually got Councillor Hines speaking against this application. If you'd like to take a seat, Councillor Hines. And you have 5 minutes. Thank you. Just hang on, Councillor Hines. I've jumped the gun again. Mr. Pearson is going to give us some background information.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, this application relates to a former's builder's yard located at the head of Dartford Road in Urmston. This is a residential road formed by a combination of terraced and semi-detached properties. There's a railway line to the rear. Planning permission was most recently granted in 2018 for the erection of a single detached dwelling at the site. The current application differs from that permission through the addition of a dormer extension to the rear. The dormer would stretch across most of the width of the property with 3 linked gable features. As the dwelling has been found to be acceptable in other respects twice previously, and it is not considered that there has been any relevant material change of circumstances to warrant taking a different view, key issues in this application are considered to be design and residential amenity. 2 letters of support were received. 2 letters of objection were received. 1 was withdrawn, whilst the other didn't relate to planning matters. The application, as we just heard, was called into the Planning and Development Committee by Councillor Hines on the grounds that the dwelling would be out of character with the rest of the road. The significant separation distances to neighbouring properties to the rear, in excess of 27 metres and over a railway line, suggest there will be no harm to residential amenity. In terms of design, the front elevation viewed from Dartford Road would remain unaltered. Viewed from the rear, it's considered that the gable features of the dormer would break up the mass of the dormer and give it the appearance of 3 separate dormers, each of an appropriate design, scale and massing. Proposal is therefore considered to comply with SPD 4, house extensions and policy L7. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Councillor Hines, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just need to really make clear to everybody that I called this application in on behalf of residents of Dartford Road. Now, their objections to this, I don't think have been reflected in this process, but I am speaking on behalf of residents tonight. I do know at least one resident who thinks he has submitted an objection. I'm not quite sure where that's gone, because as I say, it's not reflected tonight. But nevertheless, I'll plough ahead. So the applicant in his design submission states that the proposed dwelling has been designed to the highest standards and positively contributes to the enhancement of the local area through good design, providing a modern residential family dwelling in an established residential area within a sustainable location. Having looked at the plans and visited the site, I think that it may well provide a modern residential dwelling. However, the properties on Dartford Road are not modern dwellings. They're all Victorian houses and have practically identical period facades. It's one of the most uniform streets in the locality. It really is full of character and feels almost like you're stepping back in time. The addition of dormer windows to this property makes the dwelling essentially a 3-storey building. And whilst the dormer windows are at the rear of the building, they are significant in scale and design and would have some visibility from the sides. This is not the first attempt at turning this development into a 3-storey house. The original application in 2015 was actually for a 5-bedroomed property with dormer windows. This was called into planning at the time by the Urmston councillors, but then was later withdrawn by the applicant. The next application, which was granted, was for a 2-storey, 3-bedroomed house. There was a condition to that permission at section 11.2 that there would be no dormers. The further application was then submitted in 2018, seeking 2 variations to the planning permission that had been originally granted, one of which was to remove condition 11.2, which would mean that the applicant could build dormers to the rear of the property. At that time, the applicant was asked to remove this element of the application because the planning officer at the time had concerns that, and I quote from an email that he sent to me in August 2018, that I do take issue with the removal of condition 11.2, as whilst this would only allow them to build a dormer to the rear, as long as they met the specific requirements of Part 1 of Schedule 2 Class B of the Town and Country Planning, General Permitted Development England Order, we would have no say on its design and size. It would also allow them to carry out extensions to the property, and given its prominent location to the end of the road on what is a tight site, this is not acceptable given the potential negative impact it could have on visual and residential amenity. I have therefore asked the applicant to remove this element of the variation application, and the applicant at that point did agree. So this aspect of the application was withdrawn, and I then subsequently again withdrew calling. But the applicant has now applied again, and it very much seems to me that this is planning by stealth, as the property slowly creeps up to what the applicant originally envisaged it would be. I believe the concerns of the original planning officer were valid, and I'm worried that further applications to further amendments and adaptations to the planning permission granted will lead to a house which is completely out of character with the dwellings on this road. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hines. Councillor Evans, you've indicated you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Visited the site today, and I find myself disagreeing with Councillor Hines. I think the applicant has gone to quite extreme lengths to mirror the whole road in his brick layout. I even looked at the arch above the front door. He's even gone to finding discoloured bricks. I think it's particularly clever. So although it may well be a modern house, it gives the appearance of the Victorian houses. My only reservation would be his boundary walls and how he actually finishes that. And as long as that can be done in keeping, I think it's really nice. With respect to the bays at the back, what they call? Mine's gone blank. Dormers. They're going to be overlooking the railway. So so as far as the house is concerned, I think it looks pretty much like that. Okay, he's not got the roof on and stuff, but where he's up to looks pretty much like as presented in that picture there, which is totally in keeping with the rest of the street. So I just don't think that argument that we've been presented with this evening stacks up. So I would like to propose, I think he's doing a really nice job. I remember going to the site originally and it was horrendous. a typical, 1960s steptoes yard almost. And I think it'll benefit the street, and it's exactly what we want as a council for filling in effectively wasteland. So if I may propose it, I'd like to propose we accept it and grant this.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. Councillor Bunting.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll agree with not pretty much every word that Councillor Evans has just had to say. I do agree, and I'll be seconding the proposal that she's just made. The front facade, as we said, as Councillor Evans pointed out, has been painstakingly put in to make it look as appropriate as possible for that particular location. It remains unchanged from the previous applications that we granted. The only thing is the dormers to the rear. As has been pointed out in the report, there are about 4 or 5 houses with the rear dormers already on that road. You can barely see them from the front. They'll be overlooking the railway, and I can't see any problem at all. I must admit, Chairman, the one thing I do take exception to in what was said, though, was the argument this is planning by stealth. We're all sitting here in a webcast meeting discussing a report that's been published on the internet and had a consultation process around it. How on earth that can be regarded as planning by stealth, I'm not quite sure, but I'll leave that point to one side. All I have to say, as I say, I agree with Councillor Evans and I second his proposal. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Bunting. Anybody else? I visited the site. I'm not persuaded that the front of the building looks like the rest of the street. I'm not persuaded by that. I may hear what Councillor Evans and Councillor Bunting say, but I'm not persuaded by that. I think what Councillor Hines is getting at is that there was a condition put on that there wouldn't be a dormer put on this site. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know if officers can confirm that. Mr. Pearson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, there was a condition attached to the original approval which sought to remove the permitted development rights, which would have allowed the occupant of the house, once completed, to erect a dormer under permitted development rights. And had that been allowed, had that gone through in that way, we wouldn't have had any control over the design and appearance of the dormer. So what you typically get when people build rear dormers under permitted development rights are large flat roof boxes across the whole of the width of the rear roof plane. Whereas removing the permitted development rights allows us to gain control over any dormers. So it's not to suggest that we didn't think any dormers were appropriate at that time. It's just that we felt they should be controlled in terms of their size and appearance. And I think this has demonstrated, this application, that we've achieved what I think is a reasonably sensitive design in order to accommodate more room within the roof space.
Thank you, Mr. Pearson. Councillor Wetton, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think Mr. Pearson has particularly helped us with that explanation of the dormer design. And in any case, I think the point has been made about the dormers that they overlook the railway. They don't overlook the road where the residents are. And in terms of that, the house itself doesn't impact on many dwellings of that road. You'd have to really crane your neck as you get further up the road to even see it. So I think it's a good application and a good use of the site. So and the design overall, internally and externally, I think it's a good application and one well worth approving.
Thank you, Councillor Wetton. I was thinking that this thing about the dormer is that if that increases, if you like, the capacity of the house, more people can live there, more bedrooms. Whether the Urmston councils are thinking it's too big for the site, as in access along Dartford Road, because it is right at the end of the road. You wouldn't normally expect to see a house there. I'm not sure what you'd expect to see there, perhaps what Councillor Evans talked about earlier. But, local councillors come to express the concerns of the residents, and they're welcome to do that, and we encourage that. Are there any more comments from members of committee? No. Councillor Patel.
Just quickly, Councillor Hines presented a very strong case there for the residents, but clearly those objections aren't reflected in this report. And I would encourage residents, to actually engage formally with the planning process if they want their objections heard.
Thanks for that. Councillor Wetton.
Just a small point, Chairman. I mean, the dormer has only added 1 bedroom, albeit a large one and an ensuite, but it's 1 bedroom. It's made it from a 3-bedroom house to a 4-bedroom house, which is not a quantum leap. So.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against, that has been granted. Thank you. The last item this evening is on page 38. That's 56 Adele Drive in Sale. Just before comment, I visited on Sunday and noticed that there are other similar applications around about. Similar work has been done to other properties in the area. I'm happy with the report. I read it at length. And I just remind members that members of council, employees of the council, we look at their applications as carefully as we do any other application. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that a member of an employee of the council would be treated any differently. Okay, I'll shut up now. It's been moved and seconded that we grant this application. All those in favour, please show. And those against, the application has been granted. Before you go, a couple of items. The March meetings. We've got 2 meetings coming up in March. We've got the 13th and, or rather the 14th, and we're proposing a briefing the day before. The Thursday meeting will be considering Sale Town Centre. And that's quite a lengthy report. So what we're proposing is that we have a briefing the day before on the 13th. And that would start at 6 o'clock. Is everybody okay with that? Any concerns about that? 6 o'clock on the Wednesday the 13th.
Room 10, probably, unless we can get this room.
And then the extra meeting, the extra planning meeting for March is on the 28th. An extra meeting on the 28th. Now, I was wondering whether I don't like bringing people in for extra meetings, but would you like to go at 6 o'clock on the 28th of March, or do you prefer 6:30? 6:30, right. Yep, 6:30 on the 28th of March. That's the second meeting that we're going to hold. Okay. Councillor Dr. Barr. If people want to do it at 6:30, then we can do that. Is that helpful for you, Dr. Barclay? Is that helpful for you? It would be, right? Let's change that. Let's make it 6:30 for the briefing, Wednesday the 13th of March. Okay. Are there any other items we need to discuss, Ms. Coley? No? No? I think that's everything, everybody. No one's got any more questions. Councillor Weston. Thank you for that. Okay, it's 10 past 8. Happy Valentine's Day. And I'll close the meeting. Thank you.